Hey y'all, you are listening to the Theology Mill from Whitfinstock Publishers. I'm your host, Zach Mickle. So on this episode, I chat with Dr. Melissa Moschella about her new book, Ethics, Politics, and Natural Law, Principles for Human Flourishing. And just real quick, I want to say a big thank you to Notre Dame Press for providing a complimentary copy of the book for this interview. Dr. Moschella is a professor of the practice in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame's McGrath Institute for Church Life. She's also the author of the book To Whom Do Children Belong? Parental Rights, Civic Education, and Children's Autonomy, which came out in 2017. If you want to stay in the loop with what we're doing on the Theology Mill, you can follow us on X or on YouTube, or you can subscribe to our newsletter for monthly news and book deals. See the links in the show notes below to learn more about each of those. And if you're feeling generous, of course, a 5-star rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts always means a lot to us. So thanks very much if you offer us one of those. And now let's head over to the interview with Dr. Melissa Moschella. Thanks again for listening, and I really do hope you enjoy this episode. So I'm here today on the Theology Mill with Dr. Melissa Moschella, who is the author of Ethics, Politics, and Natural Law Principles for Human Flourishing from Notre Dame Press. So Melissa, thank you so much for joining me today. We're meeting on a Saturday morning, so I really appreciate you taking some time out of your weekend, especially to talk. As we get our conversation started, could you just share with our listeners maybe a bit about yourself and what you do for work?
Sure. So I'm currently at the University of Notre Dame in the McGrath Institute for Church Life. Prior to that, I was at the Catholic University of America in philosophy for a little over a decade. And I work on issues that span moral, political, and legal philosophy with a focus on natural law and the applications of natural law ethics to bioethical issues and issues related to marriage and family, especially issues related to parental rights. So that's the kind of nutshell of my work and the areas of interest.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so since we're going to be talking a lot about natural law today, let's maybe just start by unpacking that a little bit, especially for listeners who might be unfamiliar or who might just need a refresher, or who might just benefit from hearing what you have to say about it. So, how would you kind of describe natural law thinking in general? What is the term natural carry here, for instance, and then why law?
Right. Yeah, I think the term natural law is often misunderstood. I think people tend, to the extent that they think of it as a category in moral philosophy or theology at all, they will often think of it as a view where moral norms are directly derived from some observations about human nature or general descriptions about how human beings are inclined to behave. I don't think that's the correct understanding of natural law, either as a kind of on the merits or historically. I think the correct understanding is that natural law is natural not because it's describing the spontaneous workings of the natural order necessarily, but because it's describing what human beings can know naturally, that is through reason, unaided by divine revelation, with regard to ethics and morality. So it's natural in the sense that it's available to, accessible to natural reason, even without the help of revelation. It's also natural because it's a law or a set of principles and norms, rules that direct us toward the perfection of our nature. So there is a connection to human nature, but it's not just kind of looking spontaneously at what we happen to desire, but it's looking at what is the perfection of our nature and what are the norms and principles that direct us to our flourishing. And then it's law because it is a set of norms, principles, rules. So it's law in the sense that it's giving us guidance based on reason, aimed at the good of individuals and the common good of the whole of society and ultimately the whole human race.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So would divine revelation then be considered kind of an add-on to natural law, or would it be sort of a completion or like a transfiguration of natural law? Like how does I'm sure there are lots of different accounts within natural law thinking, of course, but maybe like how does divine revelation sort of figure in its relationship with natural law for natural law thinkers?
In the Christian tradition, divine revelation is thought of as complementing and in a sense adding to natural law. So it complements in a variety of ways. Many of the moral truths that are divinely revealed are truths that, at least in principle, we could know through reason alone. But there's a recognition that it can often be difficult to come to know these truths, especially the more complicated ones, through reason alone. And so divine revelation, you think the Ten Commandments, for instance, or the Golden Rule, these things are in principle knowable through reason, but having them be divinely revealed helps to make them more broadly accessible and works as a corrective to the fallibility of human reason or moral blindness, cultural moral blindness, all of these factors that can lead us to get things wrong, even though in principle we could know them.
Sure.
And divine revelation also, I think, adds things that we couldn't really know without that revelation. So, thinking, for instance, about a Christian understanding of suffering and how suffering could potentially have redemptive value, right? That's a kind of moral approach to suffering that I don't think you can get through reason alone. Or Christianity might have views about, things like going the extra mile, for instance, turning the other cheek. That again they don't contradict what we can know about requirements of justice from the perspective of natural law, but they do, I think, go beyond it. And so, there's a complementarity there, never an opposition, but Christianity gives us, I think, further insights into the situation that we're in as human beings, if you recognize that we are fallen creatures, right, who have a kind of proneness to sin, but also who have been redeemed. And so that there are these possibilities for rising above that, given our awareness of the dangers of the fact of our inclinations toward sin.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, digging into the history a little bit, I'd love to hear what you have to say about sort of the influence of some of the seminal kind of historical figures in this kind of stream of thought. So, right, the two figures that always come to mind, I think, for people are Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. So, could you say something about what influence the work of those figures has had on natural law thinking?
They're both pivotal. Aquinas, I think, is really the central figure. I mean, if you ask, I think, across the board, of any philosopher or moral theologian, I mean, who is the historical figure that you identify with the natural law tradition? Almost anybody, I think, will say Aquinas is the first person who comes to mind as having had the greatest influence. And of course, in part through Aquinas, Aristotle also has huge influence, because Aquinas' own approach to ethics was clearly shaped by Aristotle's view. There's a little bit more, I think, controversy about whether Aristotle himself was a natural law thinker. It depends exactly on how you define that. He obviously wasn't explicitly putting things in those terms or using that language directly the way that Aquinas was. But I think that the basic ingredients of a natural law view are also there in Aristotle's ethics.
Mm-hmm. So then, looking at what you call in the book, or what's called more generally the new natural law theorists, right, which is this sort of much more recent development within the tradition. So what are maybe some of the distinctive contributions perhaps corrections or perhaps additions that these much more recent new natural law theorists kind of make to this Aristotelian Thomistic kind of heritage of natural law?
The new natural law theory, and I should note here that the adjective "new" was given by the critics, not by the developers or proponents of the theory. The developers of the theory, people like philosopher and moral theologian Germain Grisey, and then his student Joseph Boyle, as well as John Finnis, especially in the areas of legal philosophy. The developers saw themselves as in continuity with the Thomistic tradition, and in some ways filling in the gaps in Aquinas's own account of practical reason. So Grisey, for instance, argued that Aquinas's theory of practical reason is fundamentally sound, but that in part because Aquinas wasn't really in the business of doing systematic philosophical ethics or even systematic moral philosophy, right? He was in the Summa doing a kind of grand narrative of, the world as coming from God and returning to God, and his discussion of natural law and virtues and related matters is all kind of within that structure. So his concern is primarily theological and primarily even within that metaphysical more than moral, although there's a lot of moral content in the Summa. And so partially because of Aquinas's main concerns, he wasn't really trying to think about, connecting all the dots in terms of giving us, every step in a philosophical argument for how you get from the foundational principles of ethics all the way to, specific moral rules like don't kill or don't steal. Instead, he gives us the first principles when he's talking about natural law in the treatise on law in the Summa, and then pretty much jumps to kind of applications categorized in relation to the virtues to get more concrete. But what he doesn't give us is what Grisey called a set of kind of intermediate principles. How do you go from these very general first principles of practical reason, do good is to be done and evil is to be avoided, and then specifying some of the things that we understand to be good, all of this in question 94, article 2 of the Prima Secundae of the Summa, where Aquinas identifies goods like life and marriage and knowledge and knowledge of God, and then in a subsequent article, the good of virtue or practical reasonableness itself. Those are identified as first principles, right? Things that we recognize as rationally worthy of pursuit, goods that perfect us in some dimension of our nature. But then, how do you get from those things to more concrete moral norms? And what the new natural law does is say, okay, we can take this and try to fill in the missing logical steps. And the argument is made that you kind of go from these first principles to moral norms by thinking about the directiveness of practical reason considered as a whole, right? Not just taking these first principles in isolation, but thinking about the guidance that they give you by taking them all together, by thinking about all of the goods toward which practical reason directs us. And from there you get what you might call a kind of general moral principle, which is to be fully reasonable. But then what does reason tell us? Well, reason tells us to respect these goods and to the extent possible, promote them for all people. So that gives you a kind of general master moral principle. And then new natural law theorists have tried to articulate intermediate principles between that general principle of being fully reasonable, listening to everything that practical reason tells us, and following all of its guidance holistically. And if you kind of parse that, you can get a number of intermediate moral principles, and there are different ways of doing this. But one way of parsing it is to think about, okay, well, at a most basic level, we should never intend harm to anybody with respect to any of these basic goods that practical reason directs us toward. And then there are principles that deal with, well, how do you prioritize different people and different goods? Since obviously we have limited time and energy, you can't promote every good for every person at every instant. That's just impossible. So then you have principles like the golden rule in terms of determining how to establish priorities between people in a way that's fair. And then principles like what I like to call the vocation principle, the idea that in order to reasonably prioritize competing goods in life, you need to approach life with a vocational sense, seriously discern what your priorities ought to be in terms of both what your talents are, what your opportunities are, also what the needs of your society are. And then you prioritize goods in accordance with a coherent set of vocational commitments. So that's just one way of kind of parsing intermediate norms. And then from those intermediate norms, you get more of the specific familiar moral rules, things like don't kill, don't steal, tell the truth, do your fair share, right? Those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. So is the new natural law kind of primarily Anglo-American in its makeup, or has it been taken up abroad as well?
The development was by Anglo-American thinkers, but it has been taken up abroad. I know there's a number of people in Hungary who at various universities there who have expressed considerable interest in this. I know thinkers in South America who have expressed considerable interest in this. I just the other day did a lecture with Sun Yat-sen University in China, where the philosopher who had organized the lecture said that there was great interest in this view among his colleagues and his students in moral philosophy in China. So it does seem to be generating broad interest even outside the Anglo-American universe.
Sure. Okay. I wonder if you might say something about kind of what your own journey has been like with new natural law. Like when did you discover it, and maybe what kind of first attracted you to it?
Yeah, so I narrate this in the introduction of the book that I was not an immediate fan of the new natural law theory. I came to it slowly, and after having been a critic, I had always been interested in moral questions and questions in political philosophy. And as I started studying these things more systematically in college, I found myself dissatisfied with the kind of typical approaches that were on offer in your standard philosophy class. You'd get utilitarianism or some version of consequentialism on the one hand, and then you'd get the option of Kantianism or some version of that on the other hand, and then maybe you'd get Aristotle or virtue ethics or something along those lines. And I thought that the Aristotle option, the virtue ethics option within an Aristotelian framework, that was the most promising because at least it avoided the extremes of utilitarianism and Kantianism. But I didn't think any of them was enough. Utilitarianism captures the intuition that morality ought to relate somehow to our good, that consequences matter, but it has a very thin understanding of the good, usually pleasure or preference satisfaction. And then it's all about consequences, such that you really can't have any absolute moral prohibitions, even torturing innocent children or, whatever you might think is something that ought to be an absolute moral prohibition. On the utilitarian view, anything could be justified, anything could be morally required if it's the thing that's going to plausibly yield the greatest good for the greatest number. And that just seemed wrong. But then Kant gave you more hard and fast moral rules. He had the moral absolutes, but the view is so formal. It's disconnected entirely from how morality relates to the human good. So that seemed problematic. And then with Aristotle, this emphasis on the virtues and on the internal character of the agent and how your actions shape you, and that seemed right. But then there's the question of, okay, but then how do you even know what counts as virtuous? if, for instance, being courageous is moderating your fear appropriately, right, in response to difficulties or dangers in order to do what's good and what's right, well, how do you know what counts as courage unless you already know what's good and what's right? So, and even Aristotle says, well, there's no virtuous mean when it comes to things like adultery or theft or murder. But how do we know that? How did we get there? So there are missing pieces there that I think the natural law perspective fills in. But when it comes more specifically to kind of my journey to so that was my journey to the natural law tradition in general, the Aristotelian Thomistic natural law tradition. But then my kind of initial education was in the direct study of Aquinas, which I thought, again, was the best thing that I had encountered up to that point. But again, as I mentioned previously, I think there are some gaps there. And I think the new natural law theory fills in those gaps. But my first exposure to the new natural law theory was through its critics. And so I was kind of primed to be critical of it. And then when I went to study at Princeton, I studied with Robert George, who's a proponent and developer of the theory. And initially I was quite skeptical, but I was fortunate to have been invited to a variety of gatherings of scholars, including Germain Grisey and Joseph Boyle and John Finnis, the developers of the theory themselves, as well as the kind of second generation of scholars. And I had the opportunity in those gatherings basically to ask all of my hardest questions. And over the course of several years attending these things, and then in the meantime, of course, doing my own reading and research and thinking about it on my own, I basically started to find that all my questions were answered, and that most of them were based on misunderstandings of the view. So I was a kind of slow convert, if you will, to the theory.
So you mentioned a few kind of first generation and also second generation figures in the movement. So people like Joseph Boyle, John Finnis, Germain Grisey, and then you and then also kind of maybe more of a second generation. You also mentioned Robert George. I wonder if you might say something about other sort of second or maybe even third generation figures that you think are doing particularly important work that listeners might like to know about. I know that there would be a lot to mention here, and you don't want to miss out on anybody, but maybe just a handful of kind of names that you think folks might be interested in.
Right. So, in that second generation, you have, in addition to Robert George, people like Christopher Tolleson, who's done, really excellent work, both on kind of foundational issues, clarifying things like the action theory of new natural law, which is one of the areas of controversy, as well as doing a lot of applications on issues in bioethics and various other issues. Also, Patrick Lee doing some excellent work on similar topics as well. And then Christian Bruegger, more in moral theology, William May, R.J. Matava, and I'm sure I'm forgetting others who I ought to be mentioning. But there's quite a robust group of the second generation, and then in the third generation, you have people like Sharif Girgis, who's primarily focused his work on law, but also is a really brilliant philosophical mind and has published several things kind of on the straight philosophy, and hopefully eventually will finish and then publish his dissertation, which is on the issue of incommensurability of goods, which is another kind of sticking point in terms of debates among new natural law theorists and with, among natural law theorists broadly and between critics of new natural law and new natural law theorists. So, hopefully that work will be forthcoming soon, because I think it'll really help clarify one area of significant controversy. And then Ryan Anderson has done work primarily on applications to kind of controversial contemporary issues. Daniel Mark has done work in philosophy of law. So, and then there are others kind of up and coming still. So, so the tradition, I think, is alive and well, and continuing to attract younger students.
Awesome. What would you say are some of kind of the most common misunderstandings of natural law thinking?
So I think with regard to new natural law in particular, I think the most common misunderstandings relate to the relationship between natural law and human nature. So a lot of critics tend to give the impression or have the impression that on the new natural law view, there's pretty much no connection between human nature and natural law. But that is a misconception. So that comes from the insistence of new natural law thinkers that you don't directly derive moral or ethical principles from observations of, metaphysical facts or biological facts about human nature. So new natural law theorists insist that the moral order has its own first principles, and this is, following what Aquinas says in question 94, article 2 in the Treatise on Law, and that these first principles of practical reason, well, they're first principles, so that means that they're not deduced, syllogistically derived from any prior principles. But that doesn't mean that they're disconnected from metaphysical or biological or psychological knowledge of human nature. And in fact, knowledge of the first principles of practical reason that direct us toward basic goods, that knowledge presupposes that we already have theoretical knowledge of these goods as possibilities. So, for instance, I can't have the practical insight that knowledge is a good, something intrinsically worthy of pursuit, unless I already know that there is such a thing as knowledge, and that knowledge is something possible for me to attain, both of which are theoretical insights. So, so there's a deep interconnection between this theoretical knowledge of human nature and the practical knowledge of the good, but the relationship is not one of direct derivation. And so I think critics often misunderstand the new natural law's insistence that there's no derivation going on. They misunderstand that as a claim that there's no connection at all, which is certainly not the new natural law view.
So you talk in the book of several what you call kind of basic human goods. So can you say something about what are those kind of basic human goods in your mind, and then specifically what makes them basic? Why describe them as basic?
The concept of basic human goods is a set of goods that practical reason recognizes to be choice-worthy for their own sake. So the idea is that, if you ask somebody, why did you do this? That answer, if you're going to get an intelligible answer to the question, is always going to terminate with reference to some basic good. So, if I ask you, what did you do to relax Friday evening or something? And you said, well, I was banging the wall all evening with a hammer. I would be rather puzzled, right? Until you started to give me some answer that immediately connected to some basic good in my head, right? So then if you start to say, well, I'm trying to learn carpentry skills. And so I was practicing a certain technique, or I was redecorating the living room to make it a more beautiful, living space for myself and my family. Oh, okay. Well, all of a sudden that makes sense to me because it connects to goods like performative excellence or beauty, right? But if you just insist, no, I was just banging on the wall for its own sake, I really would start to question your sanity, right? So the idea is that we do implicitly, right, in all of our actions, are acting with a view towards some intelligible end, right? I mean, that's just the basic Aristotelian Thomistic picture of intelligible and free action, that it's action for an end. And the ends in the practical realm are the things that we understand to be good. So these basic goods, they're basic in the sense that they are ultimate ends that give us sufficient reasons for action. They're also basic in the sense that they are known as first principles, meaning knowledge of them is not derived, as I said before, from theoretical knowledge of human nature, although it presupposes that we know what they are and that they're possible before we have the insight into their value. And they're basic also in the sense that each of the goods offers a distinct kind of benefit, such that they can't be reduced to any kind of more general category of goodness, right? So that gets at the claim that the goods are incommensurable in basic value. So you can't, add and subtract them or weigh them against each other in the way that, say, utilitarians or proportionalists in moral theology might want to try to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that. You also make, I think, an important distinction between practical truth and speculative truth in the book. So what does it mean to say, like, as you do in the book, that the moral norms that we derive from natural law are practical rather than speculative? Why is that the case?
Right. So it might help to briefly back up here and say that one of the methodological principles that undergirds the new natural law approach is Aquinas's idea of the four orders, four ways in which reason relates to order. And these four orders then correspond to different types of knowledge and different fields of knowledge and different methodological approaches to knowledge. So the first order is the order that reason can know, but in no way establishes. So that would be the order, the physical and metaphysical order, which is what it is, entirely independent of my knowledge of it. The second order is the logical order, which is the order that reason introduces into its own operations, into its own thinking. The third order is the moral order, which is the order that reason in deliberating introduces into the will. And then the fourth order is the technical order, the order that reason introduces into external things outside of the intellect and will. So ethics and moral philosophy are third order disciplines. And what we're doing when we're making free choices and engaging in actions, right, which is the domain of ethics, is in that third order. So what we're looking for when we're talking about moral truth is third order truth, which is going to differ in some ways from first order truth, that kind of speculative truth, metaphysical truth, truth in the natural sciences, as well as from the meaning of truth in logic, or the meaning of truth in the technical realm. And I think it's important to recognize this because I think very often those who are skeptical of the existence of moral truth are skeptical of it because they have a paradigm for truth that is either, truth in the first order, truth often in the natural sciences, in our contemporary culture, some version of empirical truth, or they have a view of truth that is purely formal, like logical or mathematical truth, or a view of truth that's purely functional, technical kind of truth, right? If does it work to achieve the goal that you have in mind? Whereas moral truth is different. Each of these types of truth is different. Moral truth is true insofar as what you claim about the good, or what you claim about what is morally right, is actually a true anticipation of what genuinely fulfills us and what genuinely respects and promotes the flourishing of all human beings. So moral truth is a kind of truth by anticipation of the genuine fulfillment that you seek to achieve through your actions. Whereas, say, speculative truth is a correspondence to things that already exist. So there's just a kind of fundamentally different kind of methodology and different ways of determining what counts as truth because of the nature of the truths in question. And you could say something similar with logical truth, right? Logical truth is also not something that you can test empirically, but it's obviously another kind of truth that needs to be determined, in accordance with its own proper methods.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to kind of deliberating between two or more genuine goods, what sort of guidance might natural law or the new natural law offer? Like, what are some good kind of second level principles that could help someone to kind of discern and make choices when they're in situations where it seems like they have two or maybe more goods that all seem like genuine goods?
Right. And the situation that you describe, where we're choosing between two or more genuine goods, is the situation where a morally significant choice is required. Actually, it's the only situation where a choice at all is required.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're just in a situation where you don't have two different goods, you just have more or less of the same thing, you don't really need a choice, right? If I say, you can choose, quote unquote, between, I'll give you $1 million or I'll give you $100. Either way, no strings attached, nothing. I mean, there's not really much of a choice there. Of course, you're going to take the one with more, right? It gives you everything that the 100 gives you and more. So there would be no reason at all to take the lesser amount, right? So even this possibility of a free choice presupposes this basic value and commensurability between different goods. And so when you're in this situation where free choice is required, where there are different goods that you have to choose between, or different people whose goods you have to choose between, that's the situation of morally significant choice. And the principles that new natural law theory gives you for those are several. One is that you should never make a choice in which, even with the view toward achieving some genuine good, you choose as a means to that to intentionally harm some other good, right? So, you might think of the person who conducts experiments that are harmful to human subjects with a view toward gaining knowledge, right? They're intentionally harming human beings in serious ways. There's an intelligibility to that action, but it's morally wrong because it involves intentional harm to some basic human good. So the first principle kind of rules out any way of pursuing goods that involves intentional harm to human beings with respect to any basic good. But then most of our choices among goods are less straightforward, right? Most of our choices aren't ones where we're thinking about intending harm to some good, even as a means to some further good. Most of our choices are about, what do I prioritize? Either on, a day-to-day basis, right? I have a couple free hours, what do I do? Do I exercise? Do I hang out with a friend? Do I, do some work that needs to get done, work on a paper in progress, whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. Well, those are all different goods that I might pursue. How do I choose between them? Well, I think, a choice like that is probably going to involve considering both the golden rule, right? Insofar as other people are involved, what claims do other people have on my time here? And so, putting myself in the other person's shoes in terms of what's fair in terms of my allocation of time and resources. But then also, you'll have to think about those kinds of priority choices with regard to your own vocational obligations. So, maybe that means that my free afternoon, needs to be spent, getting ahead on class prep for the next couple of weeks so that I can, responsibly fulfill my teaching obligations. Or maybe I have a deadline for a paper, and so I need to spend some time doing that, right? But maybe I don't. So maybe that means it's a good time to get outside and get some fresh air and some exercise and take care of my health, or take some time to call an old friend and keep that friendship alive, right? So there are all sorts of considerations there, and there won't be hard and fast answers, I think, to most of those sorts of questions, but it will be a matter of making those decisions about prioritization on the basis of some reasonable principle with respect to the role that these goods play in your life according to your particular vocational commitments or obligations that you have to people because of those commitments.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Okay, so maybe zooming in or honing in a bit on kind of some of the particular outworkings of natural law, especially in kind of the political realm. So in the book, you make the claim that the political community is subsidiary, and that's kind of a key term in your book. Subsidiary to the sub-political communities. So, like, for instance, friendship, marriage, family, and so forth. That the political community actually exists to serve. So, my question is, if the political community is subsidiary, what role does it take then, or what are sort of the functions of its role as subsidiary?
Right. So the idea is that you have these more basic communities, friendship, marriage, and family, and so on. Then you also have a kind of set of intermediate associations. Everything from schools and book clubs and sports leagues to businesses and larger entities in society, and then you have to think, okay, well, what is it that these smaller and in some respects more basic human communities cannot do for themselves, right? In what ways are they insufficient to provide the conditions for the flourishing of their members? And I think you can kind of pick out several areas where families and intermediate communities are going to be insufficient to secure the conditions for their own flourishing. And one of those is the need simply for order, right, among all these different groups, right? Once you get a society that is big enough and complex enough to be able to give access to kind of the full range of basic goods, as well as all the basic needs that people have just for survival, you're going to have a pretty complex society. And so you have to find some way of ensuring that all these different individuals and groups coordinate their activities in a way that's harmonious. And so you're going to need some kind of overarching authority to do that ordering and coordination, which I argue should be done through the rule of law. And then you're also going to need security from both internal and external threats, right? Security from criminals on the inside, from people outside the society who might want to violently come in and take resources or land. So you're going to need basically police and an army. You're going to need some kind of impartial and just mechanism for resolving disputes among the members of society. So you'll need some mechanism for the impartial administration of justice. You'll also need some overarching authority to coordinate people in order to have efficient and reliable provision of things like public utilities and infrastructure, kind of public goods, generally speaking. And then I also think that it's helpful to have an overarching coordinating authority to ensure that human beings who are vulnerable and dependent for whatever reason, age, illness, receive the care that they need. Now that, as with all of these things, is a subsidiary function where the primary responsibility would fall to a person's family, friends, local community. But there can be cases where people, where that's not sufficient, or where people don't have anybody to provide for their needs in cases of dependency. And so there's also a need to ensure that that kind of work of caring for the vulnerable and the dependent occurs sufficiently and occurs in a way that is also fairly distributed across society. So I think those 5 basic things are the things that political community needs to provide by providing an overarching coordinating authority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. No, yeah. Thank you. So, kind of looking at maybe other political visions on offer, what would you say are some of the differences between this kind of politics of subsidiarity that you've sketched out a bit, and then something like a libertarian politics or an anarchist politics?
So a libertarian politics would be much more minimalist than the one that I sketch out. So a libertarian politics, for instance, would be opposed to most public provision of goods, right? The libertarian might say, well, you should just have everything be provided privately through market mechanisms, and certainly any kind of social welfare using public resources, especially any coercive taxation that involves any kind of even indirect distribution of wealth and resources, that would be viewed on some libertarian accounts as effectively theft, right? Taking from people what they rightfully have through coercion, and so on my view, those would be justifiable functions of political authority, not going beyond the bounds of legitimate political authority.
Mm-hmm. So then, this politics of subsidiarity is not the same thing as a libertarian or anarchist sort of political vision. So, what though makes it maybe distinct? This sort of politics of subsidiary. What makes it distinct from maybe like classical liberal accounts of politics? On the other hand,
right. So there are some ways in which it'll appear, at least in terms of the conclusions with regard to things like protections for basic rights and civil liberties, things like freedom of speech and association and things like that. It'll look similar to liberal views, also in terms of things like respect for the rule of law and principles of limited government, separation of powers, those kinds of things. But the main difference, I think, with liberal views is that the view that I propose is one in which there's no pretense to neutrality about the good. The point of political community is, in a subsidiary way, to promote the genuine good of the members of society. And so the argument is that laws should have the truth about the human good in mind and should be in line with the truth about the human good and the requirements of the natural law that flow from that truth about the human good. Whereas most liberal accounts, at least, want to at least aspire toward neutrality with regard to a vision of the good life, and argue that laws should not be made on the basis of promoting any particular substantive vision of the good. I think that that's both impossible in practice, but also misguided in terms of what the purpose of political community is. Also, most liberal accounts tend to think that political community is artificial in the sense that it has to be authorized by consent, either explicit consent or some kind of implicit or tacit form of consent. And so I think that's also another difference, where on the natural law view, political community is not artificial. It's natural in the sense that it's a requirement for our flourishing. And so practical reason directs us to follow the laws or other directives of legitimate political authority that is in fact promoting the common good of the society. And that would be the case even if there were no explicit consent at any stage of the process of the establishment of that political authority. So those are, I think, two big differences. One, the fact that the view does have a substantive vision of the good and thinks that that's appropriate in politics. And second, that authority is not necessarily based on consent, but is simply based on practical reasons, recognition of the need for an overarching political authority in order to enable the flourishing of the community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So turning then from politics to religion, I think one of the primary, honestly, criticism that I hear sometimes of natural law, especially from Protestant friends or just from Protestants in general, is sort of like where does God fit into this picture? And from an ethical standpoint, for instance, like why do we need God if we already have natural law to guide us? So how would you respond to a question like that?
Right. So God is foundational to the picture in one way, insofar as the natural law view presupposes that there is a moral order, and the existence of that moral order, just like the existence of any order, right, the intelligible order that we see in the physical world, the existence of that order points to an intelligent ultimate cause of that order that grounds it metaphysically. So, even though I think we can know these basic truths of the practical order, these first principles directing us to basic goods, and then the moral norms that flow from them, I think we can know those things without first knowing that God exists as the ultimate grounding of those norms and of the whole moral order, just as we can know the laws of physics without first knowing that there's a God that's an intelligible creator that ultimately accounts for the intelligibility of the created universe.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, we can reason back from the existence of that order to the fact that, well, it must be grounded metaphysically in some intelligent ultimate cause that we call God, and that is what ultimately makes sense of it and fully grounds it philosophically. And once you recognize that God is the ultimate ground of the moral order, that also helps to deepen your kind of confidence in the reliability of the moral law and your motivation to follow the moral law, because now what's at stake is not merely, your kind of practical recognition that following the moral law is necessary for human flourishing, but also this further recognition that in following the moral law or not, your relationship with, your harmony with God, the ultimate cause of the moral law, is also at stake. And so that kind of adds an added layer of depth to your understanding of moral obligation and to your sense of moral motivation. And that's just at the level of what we can know through natural reason. I think that grounding then goes kind of even deeper in terms of our confidence in the moral law and its goodness when you add revelation, which gives us even further reasons to believe that God is not only an intelligent creator, but a good and benevolent creator who desires our flourishing and desires it, from the Christian perspective, so ardently that he sent his only son to become a human being and to die on the cross in order to achieve our salvation, right? Which all of that goes well beyond what we can know through reason, not contrary to it, but goes well beyond it, and even further deepens our sense of what's at stake in whether or not we follow the moral law, but also deepens our sense of confidence in the moral law as being true guidance that aims at our flourishing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for taking the time today. Are there kind of, as we come to a close, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to add, whether that's on the book or on new natural law or natural law in general?
Nothing immediately comes to mind. I'm sure I'll think of something in 5 minutes, but you know how that is.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for taking the time. Like I said, on a Saturday morning, so I appreciate that very much. For listeners, the book is Ethics, Politics, and Natural Law: Principles for Human Flourishing from University of Notre Dame Press. So, Melissa, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.